YouTubers like to talk about their successes, myself included, simply because it makes us feel good. But that doesn't mean we don't have our history of failures. In fact, if I do a retrospective on my own professional journey, I probably had more failures than successes, and it's one of these failures that I'd like to talk about with you in this video. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Tomasz, and I use this channel mainly to talk about our journey of developing a custom 10 gigabit router called Gateway. Now, yes, I admit, I mainly share our wins, or highs if you will, simply because I've been lucky enough that most of the lows that we've encountered along this journey have been successfully resolved. Sometimes by hard work, and other times by sheer luck. But this wasn't always the case, and those of you who have been following my channel for a while probably already know where this is going. My keyboard project that I often talk about through my PCBWay sponsor segment, which I'll use in this video as well, has failed. And I don't mean this in the context of building it, because with that we 100% succeeded. What I mean is in the context of building a business around it, but to understand what happened, or more importantly why it happened, we need to go a few years back. You see, during the pandemic, which started in 2020, I had more time on my hands, for obvious reasons, and one hobby that literally consumed me at that point were mechanical keyboards. Now, in order to understand why I decided to design my own, you have to understand the state that the mechanical keyboard industry was in at the time. If you wanted a high-end keyboard, well, you only had one option: participate in a group buy. And no, an expensive Logitech plastic piece of is not considered a high-end keyboard. These group buys were much like a GoFundMe thing. Basically, someone would design their own keyboard, find all the vendors needed to produce it, and then everyone else that wanted to participate, as in own one of these keyboards, would wire their funds either directly to the person organizing the group buy or a web store that already had a reputation in this space and stepped in as a legal business entity. Come to think of it, I'm surprised there weren't that many scams around it when it comes to this practice, because I probably ordered around 7 different keyboards at that time and eventually received all of them. Now, I use the word eventually here very much on purpose, because these things took a lot of time. Like, in a couple of cases, I think I waited about 2 years for a keyboard. You heard that right, 2 fucking years. For a keyboard that we had to pay in advance, in full, and every single one of them would cost more than around $400. And that's without switches and keycaps that both needed to be purchased separately. Also, don't judge me. Apart from the extreme waiting times, because the word long just doesn't cut it here, all these group buys also had another problem, and that problem was the fact that these were all one-off thing, which meant that if any of those keyboards died at some point, I had absolutely no way of purchasing a replacement PCB, simply because they weren't made anymore after the group buy was done. Now, fast forward 2022, which is when I decided to leave the company I founded 10 years prior, called Codable. This was the time that all the boards from the previous group buy started to arrive, and frankly, I was not satisfied with any of them. I mean, there was nothing wrong with them, and they worked just fine, still do for that matter, but the one thing I hated the most was too much branding. I mean, it's a one-off thing, for Christ's sake. Why do you have to put your logo everywhere, right? So, with all these frustrations and some extra cash I had on my hands due to the sale of my shares of Codable, I decided, you know what, I'll design, develop and manufacture, say, 50 units that will be available for sale immediately after being manufactured, with zero risk to potential buyers and a 10-year warranty. Now, because I'm not an electrical engineer, I also needed to hire someone to design the PCB, and that someone is now my co-founder Aljaž, who's also the lead designer on the router hardware. We actually met through a mutual acquaintance that owns a CNC shop. The same CNC shop that produced all the enclosures for the keyboards, these ones that you see here. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's wrap up the idea part of this story. So, the idea was that first I'll fund the development of the keyboards out of my own pocket, just to make a point, I guess. And that point was that someone had the skill, knowledge, and I guess courage to pull this off on their own. And truth be told, I did. But let's say mistakes were made along the way. And the first mistake was not realizing how small batches become exponentially more expensive to manufacture compared to larger ones. Let me give you an example. We were quoted $100 per PCB for 10 of them, but if we ordered 50, we would pay $40 per unit. And if we increase the size of the order to, let's say, 100, we'd pay $25 per unit. Because of this, and this is called the economy of scale, I decided that at 50 keyboards, the curve started to flatten enough that it would make sense to produce that many. However, because there was an ongoing chip shortage at the time, I decided to double my order just in case. So I ordered 100 of these PCBs. This is how they look, and I basically have 50 extra collecting dust in my storage. So if any of you has a need for them, please reach out. But there was also another obstacle when it comes to the manufacturing, and that's the fact that with an order of 50 units, nobody really took us seriously. Actually, you know what? Let me take that back. We were taken seriously. We were just pushed all the way to the back, to the end of the line, by every single manufacturer, because obviously they would always prioritize larger clients that also made more orders more frequently, right? So it became kind of a waiting game, which, especially when it comes to the case, I took advantage of and really focused on the design with two objectives in mind. First, make it as minimal as possible, no obscene branding or design elements that would look out of place at any point in the future. This episode is brought to you by PCBWay. I've been working with them on my custom keyboard project, and I was super impressed with their speed, quality, and price, so I'm more than happy to recommend them to anyone who needs any kind of PCB manufacturing done, whether it's just for a couple of prototypes or if you need a larger production run. Link to their website, of course, down in the description. Back to the video. And second, I guess as an engineering challenge to myself, make it screwless. Now, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any screws on the board, it just means that none of them should be visible. And truth be told, I succeeded in both. But what I didn't realize at the time was how expensive the screwless approach would be. You see, in order to achieve that, the enclosure had to be milled out of 3 pieces of aluminum rather than your standard 2 that most of the competition was milled out of. And what's even more unfortunate, none of the pieces turned out to be particularly simple, so all this experiment did was to add another 30% to the cost of raw aluminum, 30% to the milling time, and 30% to anodizing. And speaking of anodizing, I didn't just want to settle with anyone anodizing the enclosure, I wanted the best the country has to offer. And I found them, and they were expensive. I mean, don't get me wrong here, the enclosure turned out to be absolutely fantastic, and with the amount of aluminum and the screwless approach we took, should survive a goddamn nuclear blast. But the problem is, all these choices made it incredibly expensive. For 50 units, after it was all said and done, I spent around $400 per keyboard. No margins here, not a single hour of my work paid for, just 20 grand spent on what I thought was the best keyboard any human has ever made. And when I say best, I mean that in the context of construction quality. But then came the reality. Regardless of what price I decided to sell them at, almost nobody wanted them. Not because they weren't good enough or anything was wrong with them, but simply because they were too expensive and the majority of normal human beings simply aren't willing to pay that kind of money for a keyboard regardless of how good it is. So, what did I do? Well, I dropped the price. And then I dropped it again and again and again to the point I was basically just trying to clear the inventory. And with every drop, I did sell a couple, but unfortunately for my, wallet, never sold enough or through all of them, which means that I still, to this very day, have a couple of them left in my storage. I removed the Shopify page quite a while ago because, as you probably know, I completely shifted my focus to the development of the router, with which I took a completely different route. No pun intended. Now, before we completely wrap this chapter of the video up, and with it my keyboard manufacturing journey, I think it's worth going through every mistake I made along the way and discuss what I've learned from it, and even more importantly, how we're not making those same mistakes when it comes to the manufacturing of our router. First, and I think by far the most important thing, was not talking about it enough. In fact, I didn't talk about it at all. Reason being that I thought, okay, let me first design, develop and manufacture it in a bit of a stealth mode, and once I'm done, as in once the keyboard is released to the world, everyone will go, wow, what an amazing product you made there, Tomasz. Well, in reality, it was more of that awkward silence type of thing with crickets in the background. And since you're watching this video and likely following this channel, you probably already know how we're approaching the development of the router on the other hand. I've started publishing the videos on the topic even before I launched any 3D CAD or any other kind of design software, just to make sure three things were clear. A, that the market for the device we planned to build at that time indeed existed. B, that we knew how to talk to and get feedback from the target market, so through this YouTube channel. And C, that we could manufacture the device at the price that was acceptable for the target audience. But there's also a fourth point to this that cannot be understated, and that's the fact that sharing this journey has proven to be a great marketing tool in and of itself, because with every single video that I make on the topic, between 10 and 20 pre-orders come in either on the same day, or if the video is relatively successful, up to 50 or so in a matter of 3 to 4 days, right? The next point of failure was my no compromise approach. Yes, I wanted the best of the best when it comes to the enclosure, the PCB, and fun fact, I even hired the same person to design the shipping box that designed the gift package for Queen Elizabeth when she was visiting the country some years back. This is how much I was obsessed with achieving the best possible quality. But, unfortunately, quality does come at a price, and as it turns out, the majority of people actually prefer some compromises if that results in a cheaper product, right? But how much cheaper, you might ask? Well, to answer that, we actually did what's called the Van Westendorp price analysis, and yes, we do have a dedicated video on the topic, which I'll leave down below the like button. In a nutshell, this analysis involves asking the target market 4 questions, and based on the answers, extrapolates the most optimal price for the product, which in our case for the router is around $300. Now, unfortunately, we won't be able to hit that mark, simply because we are not willing to make some compromises when it comes to the capabilities and features of the device that we believe makes us stand apart from the competition. But, luckily for us, it's not a binary result. It simply means that if it's more expensive, some people will not consider buying it, which is okay, right? But we didn't leave it there. You see, talk is easy. Everyone can say whatever they want on the internet, so the real litmus test here is when people actually have to pull out their wallets. And to my immeasurable happiness, almost 900 of you have indeed pulled out your wallets and proved us, well, on the majority of our assumptions. The product we're making does have a place in the market, is priced somewhat reasonably, and you do trust that the team behind it is able to pull it off. Now, before we wrap this video up, 2 things. First, this is my only video for this month, because we're now waiting for the manufacturing of the second revision of prototypes, which gives me some time to take the family on holidays. They've been nothing but supportive throughout this journey, and they definitely deserve for me to spend a bit more time with them, right? And second, there is a silver lining to this whole keyboard failure story. One that I believe many of you might be interested in. You see, not too long ago, I heard a saying that no effort ever goes to waste, and this got me thinking, how can we make sure that the effort of developing our keyboard does not go to waste? Well, apart from everything that we learned how not to do certain stuff, that is. And the answer to that will likely not surprise you if you've been following my channel for any length of time, and that answer is open source. We're open sourcing everything when it comes to the keyboard. Step files for the enclosure, DXF files for the plate, the gaskets and the feet, and all the files that are necessary for the PCB production. So Gerber files, bill of materials, and assembly instructions. But you don't really need those because you will be able to generate them yourself, because we're also open sourcing Altium source files themselves. And as a candy on top, we're also adding QMK firmware files as well as a PDF, which is basically all the documentation that you need in order to take the whole project and hopefully learn a thing or two about designing a physical product. See you in August. Tomasz in Slovenia, signing out.